This is the third part of Unit 1 about Georgia's physical features. One of the things I really like about this map is that you can see just how much water there is. Of course, these are lakes and rivers, but all of these areas that sort of have the darker green, the lines, are areas of woodland close to, in some cases, large rivers and streams. Here's the Okefenokee Swamp. Georgia has many, many, many rivers, and usually we get rainfall to fill all those things. Now, these rivers are important. Today, water is used for drinking, like from the Chattahoochee, recreation. You all know what you all can do for fun on rivers: fishing, skiing, um, all the things that you do during the summertime. Industry, transportation, and irrigation. In the past, water was used for transportation and hydropower, like we've already talked about, with cities on the fall lines. Some of the waterways from Georgia flow into the Gulf of Mexico, but most flow into the Atlantic. The Sea Islands, or the Golden Isles, are the barriers that protect the coast. Georgia also has lots of swamps and marshes, so water is an important thing in our geography. Some of the major rivers are the Etowah and the Coosa, the Chattahoochee, the Flint, the Chattooga, the Savannah, the Oconee, the Ocmulgee, and the Altamaha. The Etowah-Coosa system, that's basically all of this right here, flows into Alabama and then eventually down into the Gulf of Mexico. The Chattahoochee River system flows from the Blue Ridge up here into Lake Lanier, then down through Atlanta to West Point Lake, and then all along the border between Georgia and Alabama. And eventually it meets with the Flint and forms Lake Seminole, and from there to the Gulf, it is the Apalachicola River. The Chattahoochee River supplies water for Metro Atlanta and people in Alabama and Florida. So people in those states have argued over the fairest way to use this river. It's usually not a problem unless there's a drought, and there have been droughts. The Flint begins just south of Atlanta and eventually flows sort of through Albany and down into Lake Seminole. The Chattooga, Tallulah, Tugaloo rivers, that's these up here, flow into Lake Hartwell and then eventually into the Savannah River and out into the Atlantic. The Port of Savannah is one of the busiest ports in the United States. It's unbelievably important for transporting goods in and out of Georgia and therefore the United States. The Continental Divide is a line in which rivers on one side flow one way and rivers on another side flow in a different direction. There are several continental divides in the United States. The most famous one is out west, but there is an eastern continental divide, and this basically is where I'm from. And I remember my dad telling me that it was interesting that the Satilla River, which is in the eastern part of my little county, ends up in the Atlantic, but the Alapaha River here ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. Georgia waters end up in one of those two places. Georgia also has a whole series of beautiful barrier islands. Tybee and Little Tybee, Wausau, St. Catharines, Blackbeard, Wolf, Little St. Simons, Jekyll, Little Cumberland, and Cumberland. On the 8th grade trip, we'll be going to St. Simons, Jekyll, and Cumberland. The western sides of these islands are, the western sides of the islands are marshes, and we'll see lots of those on our trip. The eastern sides are beaches. Along the beaches are sand dunes, and beyond them, inside, further inland, are um, forest of pine and live oaks draped with Spanish moss. To help larger boats, the Intercoastal Waterway was created in the 1930s to help clear a deep passage between the islands and the mainland. So the Intercoastal Waterway comes all the way up through here. Wind and waves are always reshaping the barrier islands, and we'll talk more about how that happens a little later on. Islands have abundant wildlife. They're an important part of the ecology. Um, there are sea turtles, shrimp, crabs, whales. On the 8th grade trip, we'll learn about a lot more of those. The climate and the beautiful location have attracted some of America's wealthiest families to build homes, like on Sapelo or Cumberland or Jekyll. And even today, those things influence fishing, recreation, and tourist industries. Let's take a look. You can see when we go to this on Cumberland Island that the eastern parts of a barrier island are beaches, and the western parts are marshy. And we'll take a look at this before our 8th grade trip, but you can see in this image, you've got beaches, these are dunes, and this is the maritime forest on Cumberland. Georgia also has swamps, over 450. Most are in the coastal plain, but a few are in the Piedmont. The Okefenokee is the largest one in southeast Georgia. The peat soil is soft and spongy, and it's solid, sort of, but it's not really attached at the bottom, so that's why they called it Land of the Trembling Earth. Home to many, many, many kinds of wildlife: birds, fish, alligators, bears, frogs, storks, cranes, otters. Unbelievable amount of wildlife in the Okefenokee. That wraps it up for physical features, and we'll be talking more in class about the rivers of Georgia. Thanks much.